Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along this morning. The last people get their party pies and take their seat. Welcome to today's exclusive download of the Yardi Property Council PropTech Survey results. My name is Chris Wild. I'm the National Membership Director at the Property Council. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to anyone joining us here today that is from an Indigenous background. And I'd also like to pay my respect to the lands that people are beaming in from online. Yardi has been a sensational partner to the Property Council over a number of years, and this is the third year that they're helping us deliver the PropTech survey. So I'd like to acknowledge their long-standing support to the Property Council, and of course to Bernie Devine, who has been a contributor to the Property Council in various different ways for a number of years. And also thanks to our research team for gathering the data and crunching it today. Also thank you to Lendlease. They're a great friend of the Property Council for hosting today. Their generosity extends well past today, and they always make us feel very welcome as a meeting place and point of connection for our members. Without any further ado, I don't need to introduce Bernie. I'm sure he'll be very capable of doing that himself, but Bernie Devine from Yardi. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. G'day and welcome. This survey has its origins in some work with Property Council over 20 years ago. Originally doing a review of listed property companies globally and trying to understand what they were doing in terms of spending on technology and what that meant in terms of the technology sector and its engagement with the real estate industry. And that's always been, I think, the core of a lot of what I have done and been involved in real estate and technology now for nearly 40 years, in various roles, everything from leasing through asset management, investment management, and very often providing technology solutions in some way or form in terms of being either a client, a consultant or a vendor. And I guess the genesis of this particular version of this research has come from, again, saying what has the technology industry got to do with real estate, and how's the real estate industry viewing technology as a solution? Because if I go back to about 2000 when we first did that study, the majority of companies spent, if we were lucky, 1% of their total revenue on technology. Thankfully, that's moved forward a touch. And I think this is, as Chris said, now the third time we've done this, but it's wrapped around a continued process of talking to people in the industry, understanding attitudes, and trying to see what is the way forward. And you might say, what's the overarching purpose of all of this? It's really to raise awareness, to help people better understand what are the things that they could be doing. I certainly have a view that one of the challenges that many organisations have is, what do I do first? And trying to deal with that. So providing those sort of first tangible steps to allow people to move forward is really a key thing. So I think the key thing in terms of the survey this year, we had, and I'm just reading my notes again because I can't remember it, it was a pretty hefty response, and we had 266 responses. So I think that's sort of fairly heavy in terms of the number of people, and therefore fairly robust in terms of what we can see in the results. And a couple of key things for me was that there was a decent number of folk from the private equity space in real estate. At the same time, there was a good number of folks. So in terms of mid and senior management, more than half of the respondents were mid and senior management. So a broader view of their business, and therefore an understanding of some of the things that really do drive the business. And a lot of the people, and it does play to some of the answers to questions later, but a lot of the respondents were actually involved in the budgetary process in their organisation. So budgeting, forecasting, looking at what revenues and costs will be in the future. Interesting things. And that is that, in summary, and I don't think it's a huge surprise, but AI was seen as one of the key factors that's emerging as a technology that's making a difference. Secondly, I think the key factor, and this is a recurring theme for many years now, is what are the impediments to adopting technology? And change management, quite frankly, always has been. For the 20 years that I've been looking at this data and asking people about what's going on with tech and what's hard to do, it's change management is the key. And I'd say, most organisations learn the hard way that they're not great at change management. And it's certainly something that I think organisations need to focus on and bring in specialist expertise to make sure that they get that right. That in terms of looking at adopting technology, that they bring in the right resources with the right focus to help their business as usual teams get through a difficult transition in terms of adopting new technology. But part of the challenge today is that this is not something you do every once in a while now. This is constant. And I think for me, it's really interesting that on the one hand, Apple keeps updating my iPhone, and that happens to all of us, obviously, and we live with it. None of us like it, but we live with it. But when it comes to change at work, it gets much harder. And I think that's part of what we need to focus on here is the fact that it is something that we do more and more, and it's something that really needs to be worked on. The other thing I think is important out of this slide is just understanding the fact that capable resources in terms of driving change, not just in terms of helping make change happen, but delivering it effectively in terms of resources to deliver configuration, customization, whatever's needed. And that comes back to the tech sector to look at resourcing and to look at education and to look at growing the resource capability of the sector. I think the other thing that's interesting, and I have to say this is a pretty crazy slide. It took me a minute when I looked at the data and looked at the slide. I said, how does this work? And I won't get into the detail of it too much, other than to say that it really is about, for example, saying if you look at the valuation and reporting part, it's saying that, excuse me, approximately 20% of respondents said that their team spent more than 25% of their time on vals. That's really what this slide says, amongst other things. And then when you understand that, the things that come out to me is, one, keep in mind I said a bunch of the respondents are involved in the budgeting and forecasting process in their organisations. Two, so they know more about that, right, and what's happening in their organisation in that space. But two, when I looked at this slide, I said, and the data behind it, it's the amount of time that organisations are spending on budgeting, forecasting, vals, reporting and analytics. It's massive. And it goes to, I think, something further down the line that I'll show you in a minute in terms of another slide. But it's really driving the fact that there is a lot more work to be done in the real estate sector to automate process beyond accounting and basic lease administration. This is, I think, for me, one of the slides I put up every year when we do this, whether it's the survey here, the survey in New Zealand, or the survey in Asia that we do. Or in fact, more recently, we've started doing it in Europe and the UK as well. And that is percentage of spend. Because like I said, if I go back to about 2000, the percentage of spend that organisations had on technology was approximately 1%. There were a few outliers, some up to 5 and 6%. There were a couple of major US organisations listed back then who I recall were close to 10%, but they were rare exceptions. And if you compare it to other industries, if you're looking at banking and finance, the level of spend on tech amongst those organisations is in a completely different league. So I think historically we've now seen that there's been a move, there's definitely been a shift, and I think through the pandemic we've seen organisations take a stronger focus on technology, and the percentages are growing. The importance of the cost of technology to an organisation is growing, and therefore, one would expect value and return on investment likewise to be something that's more of a focus. And I won't dwell on it, but if you go through the detail of the report, you'll see that in fact a lot of organisations are still struggling with how to articulate ROI on technology investments. A topic of really quite some interest is, I'm sorry, I've got out of sync here. Let me get onto that slide. A topic of some interest here is what's the technology that's going to drive the most change in organisations in the future. And historically, we probably focused on the next 12 months. We've really changed that focus to be the next 5 years. And there's no question that artificial intelligence is definitely one of the key factors. And I think the thing for me is really, as I read this data and thought about it, was to say, where do companies think AI is going to make the biggest difference? Right? As it becomes more of a reality, if I look back 12 months to the last time we did this report, most people hadn't interacted with an AI on purpose. They might have done it by accident, but they hadn't done it on purpose. But today, in the last 4 months, it's become enormously easy for folks to literally go to a website and engage with an AI deliberately. And the number of things that have come out of that are really quite interesting. But I think, what does that really mean in terms of the level of change that organisations are going to see as a result of AI? And an interesting sort of anecdote in that space is a client of ours recently implemented one of our chat tools that's AI driven, and the first weekend that it ran handling consumer inquiries over the weekend on their build to rent in the UK, they came in on Monday morning and thought the thing had broken because they had no queries from their website. The reality was the AI had dealt with every single one of them, and they had nothing to do. So really quite changed things for them. And I think that's sort of the thing is, where is it going to make a difference, and what does that mean in terms of focus? And I'll come to this in a couple of slides. What does that mean in terms of the focus of the PropTech industry? Because funding follows revenue. So where's the revenue? What does that mean is going to be funded, and what does that mean in terms of areas that the industry is going to focus on? But it does come back to a core issue that's always been an issue for me. And for me in particular, it's really interesting because I was in a startup a long time ago, and my business partner was one of the co-authors of VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet that ran on a PC. And we spent a lot of time selling spreadsheets, and probably for 10 years I made a lot of money selling spreadsheets. But today, spreadsheets are the bane of my life because they're not a system, they're not a process, they're just a table with data in them. And when you look at this slide, it's really quite interesting to say, well, yeah, everyone's got the message, or most people anyway, in terms of accounting and property management, get that into a system. But if you go back to what I mentioned earlier, the whole issue of budgeting and forecasting, evaluations, and the amount of time people are spending on those activities. Why? Because it's not in the system. It's really quite fundamental, right? So what does that mean in terms of adoption of systems? And for me, I think some of the things for the panel to talk about are things like, have we reached the point where we're moving processes in businesses to systems is really starting to happen at a more effective rate, at a more realistic rate? Is adoption and automation of process moving beyond just the accounting department? And what does that really mean for return on investment in technology? Then I'd say sustainability. And as much as in the last 2 or 3 months, I think AI has really had a huge dominance in the headlines from the tech space. For me, I still think that the most important message, the most important tool is really about sustainability and how technology can help in that space. And it comes back to a couple of key things. One is that it does go back to the whole issue of automating process. And what we find as we work with clients in that space is that a lot of what happens in that space is not automated. Right? If I look at what we're experts at, which is taking a journal entry and an invoice and turning that into information for an investment manager, if you try and do the same thing with data on energy, is reasonably easy because it's got a financial comparable. There's an invoice there or something. But when you get to some of the things under social and governance, it gets hard because there's not a proxy, right? And it's not necessarily in a process, or if it is, it's probably not automated. It's relatively immature. And my sense is that the technology industry and the people who are experts in ES&G really need to get together and focus on how to focus tech to really change how things happen in that space and help us deliver better results. There's no question that in terms of controlling systems, building systems, etc., there's been a lot of advances in that, but connecting all that together and bringing it back to the business is a key objective, I think. So that gets me to what comes next. And that's sort of a segue to the panel, because that's what comes next. But at the same time, I think it's also a question, as I went through this report and looked at this data, a big part of it was to say, what are the next questions we should be asking? We've been fairly consistent in asking the same questions for a number of years, tweaking them a bit for local context or for specific things like the pandemic. But really this time around, we've taken a hard look at what are the questions we should be asking for the future. And I think today, I'm really excited that we've got some experts, some people who know what they're talking about to help us with that. And I think I've given Chris and the team a bunch of questions, and I'm happy to help out with answering those questions. But I think that what comes next is really what's important. What do we do about it? How can we help real estate companies improve their use of technology and get a better ROI? And that to me is what's really important. So thanks.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you for joining us. It really feels like I've been sort of spending a lot of my time in the last year thinking about technology during studying. It feels like the industry is in a tipping point. It feels like things are really starting to speed up, going from like, let's just do technology to, okay, well, we can do something with this and get really structured in the way that they're doing things. And across property managers, real estate, investors, agents, everyone's looking for new ways to either, improve efficiencies, reduce costs, or enhance the customer experience. It's really tech is sort of emerged as a vital tool in that, and can only see it getting a little bit more aggressive in the way that plays a part in our lives. On the panel today, down the far end, is Alice Drew, the General Manager of Place Futures at Lendlease. We've also got Julian Keselman, the Innovation Director at Taronga Ventures, and Mel Hardy, Director of Business Performance and Technology at QIC. And I'll get them to sort of just introduce their part in the world as I sort of get into the first sort of questions here. But we're going to sort of take, instead of going through the survey, we're going to try and pull out some topics and look at what tech is actually sort of touching our lives in the property sector. We'll draw down on some innovation. ESG is absolutely something we want to dig in today. AI, which is just getting crazy with some of the stuff I've been reading the last few days. And of course, what next is really important part of it too. So, prop tech has been something we've heard about for a lot of years, Bernie. And I'll start with you. It means a lot of things to a lot of people, but when you're sort of thinking about prop tech, what is it that you're thinking about when someone says that term to you?
Yeah, I've got to use this thing. Look, I think I always try to avoid help defining what is prop tech, because I have a very simple view of it in my own mind, which is anything to do with the real estate industry that's got some sort of technology involved in it. And when I've been pressed a few times, I've said, go to the RICS website. They've got this diagram that says what's the real estate universe, and my answer is anything to do with tech that has anything to do with anything on that image is probably prop tech. It's that simple, and don't get hung up on it.
Pretty simple. Alice, down the end, the General Manager of Workplace Futures probably, seems to me to be a title of someone that thinks maybe not about tech so much, but just what tech's going to mean for the future of people. When you're sort of considering the position, in your day-to-day, what does the future look like in terms of, is it the Jetsons and flying cars, or is it something different for people in the future interacting with property?
Yeah, good question. I feel like when we talk about the future of property, and property is a people business, let's just set the scene on that. Like the property is just here to provide for the needs that we all have as a business or as individuals. And we always think of the experience that we need to create for people. So placemaking is part of our DNA, and placemaking is all about creating that experience. So we always look not just at what's happening kind of today, but we're looking much further into the future. And that means we need to look at generationally what is happening. And we're about to, within the next 7 years, we're actually going to have around 45% of the workforce is going to be Gen Z or Gen Alpha. These are people who are basically born with an iPhone as a second limb, or an extra limb. So we're constantly looking at what matters to people of those generations. And sometimes it's got overlaps with us, sometimes it really doesn't. And they care very deeply about the purpose of their work, the meaningfulness of the work that they do. And they're not just going to go to places because their managers tell them to turn up. We keep going back to places, all of us, this is why we travel the world. We keep going back to places because they make us feel something. They give us joy, or they make us feel surprised, or they connect with us emotionally. And so we're always looking for placemaking to do all of those things. And future experiences for people are going to be ones that are immersive. Technology is going to be critical to all of that. But technology at the end of the day, just like place, is really a tool for businesses. So if technology can help us connect better with the world, then it's useful. If place can help us connect better with the world, then it's useful. So we're always looking at how do we do that better in more sustainable ways, in ways that engage people, connect people, and make them healthier and more well than when they started the day.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful context, because sometimes we seem to get a little bit hung up on tech being tech, but if you bring it back, it's about how do people interact with the building, which is the business we're in, which is really important. And Mel, I'll jump to you because I know you're responsible for asset technology and also work with the QIC business on process and efficiency internally. What sort of conversations are you having with stakeholders about technology, and how is that sort of changing in your world?
Yeah, it's definitely changing. I think, Bernie, you pointed out, most companies are starting to sort out their accounting systems and lease management systems. That's kind of the table stakes, and we've thankfully got through the hard yards around that. I think it's a link between probably the conversations I'm having and the definition of prop tech that Bernie mentioned. It's really across the gamut of our real estate business. How do we use the systems and the tools and the smarts of the technology to enable the real estate business? And we kind of group it into three buckets of conversational focus for us. One being the customer experience, and that customer can be an office worker, a retail worker, a tenant in a mixed use space. Think of that in the broadest definition. It can be the buildings themselves in terms of smart buildings and those building management systems, or it can be the actual business of doing real estate itself and how we do that as quickly and efficiently and make the right decisions and use the capabilities and the data that we all have to do it better. I think it's quite a broad conversation. I enjoy the combination of the business performance side of my role and the technology side of my role because of that, bringing together those two disciplines and seeing how it's not tech for tech's sake, but it's tech for a business outcome. I think that's where you have really productive conversations and productive projects, and the ROI conversation becomes a lot more closely coupled, because it's not the ROI of installing software or installing hardware. It's the ROI of the business outcome that you're enabling by making that investment in the kit.
And Julian, I quite like this title, the Director of Innovation. I know you did great things at Taronga. You play a really interesting role in the middle of it because you have people invest or prop tech startups that you deal with, and you also deal with some of our larger members of the Property Council. What are you hearing when it comes to this space, and what do you see as the priorities for the property industry?
Yeah, so for us at Taronga Ventures, I mean, we're focused on emerging technologies that are going to impact the sector into the future. And to just throw a bit of a spanner in the works, we use the framing real tech, but it's just the same as Bernie's. So we want it to be as expansive as possible. So it's not just about property, it's about all real assets. And so a good way to think about this is, Dexus's transaction with AMP Capital on the infrastructure side has just wrapped up. So now they're looking at traditional property in terms of commercial, industrial, etc., as well as airports and ports and roads, etc. And so what's really interesting for, I guess, some of our owners looking out into the future is how technologies we're using in a commercial setting can actually be applicable into these new asset classes, right? So a good example is a company we invest into called Xandercardian, which uses radar-based sensors to actually monitor your breath rate and your heart rate to detect how many people are in the room here. And then you can use that to modulate, lights and HVAC, things like that. But where this has become applicable is we've actually moved it over into a healthcare setting to actually monitor the condition of patients in long-term stay. So you can actually get a time series of data on somebody's heart rate or their breath rate to then inform how their condition is going to unfold over the coming hours. So thinking about those types of linkages of what are technologies we're using in a standard commercial setting, how can they actually change our investment practices and the operating practices of our owners has become a real topic of interest.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. You touch on aged care because we've obviously got a pretty large part of our memberships in aged care, and when we think about the prop tech term, and I'm with you on the real tech, we sort of just try and put into a hole that it's office. But when we start to think outside of just the traditional places that we do, build to rent is going to be a burgeoning sector. Like, how do we start to integrate into some of those more residential parts of property is going to be a big question. And maybe let's stay with you for the moment, Julian, because innovation's played a big part in my year. Invested quite a lot of time to study what it meant, and I think this is going to play an interesting part in technology in the world, because I think I've got two questions here. How do you think organizations should be thinking about innovation firstly, is my first question.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we hope is that people aren't just thinking about innovation, that they're actually doing it. We think that it's a real essential practice for really the long-term kind of viability of the business. When you think about what innovation actually is, it's about reimagining your business into the future, right? And so when we're seeing traditional property business models reaching a point of maturity and needing that reinvention, what are things going to look like 5 or 10 years out, right? So it's all about how can we think about using our existing asset base to reposition, to provide new forms of value and utility to occupants and tenants, right? And creating new experiences as well that kind of augment what is the day to day for an occupant as they step into a space. But what we think is important is that innovation is a journey, right? It's not something that gets solved in a year by engaging with an innovation program. For example, it's a practice that needs to be built up over time. The organization needs to I guess suffer some stumbles along the way, right, and learn how to make bets and how to scale those bets over time. If we're truly gonna reinvent the business models that real estate has relied on up until today.
So do you think it's fair to say that there can't be innovation without technology moving into the future of property?
I would say yes. I mean, I'm a techno optimist, obviously, but look, all technology is necessarily innovation, but there's also forms of innovation that are not technology, right? So, I mean, walking into this beautiful Lendlease space, there's some big green walls on the stairway between the 2 floors, right? And I know this company, Junglefy, they provide it's a natural solution, right, which is helping to improve air quality in the space, right? For example, but technology for these kind of large scale transformations is absolutely critical. We need technology to baseline where we're at today, right, and then manage the innovation process such that the more transformative technologies we can start to plan for the impact that we want them to create on our portfolios.
So then, Alice, if I come back to you, and I'm sure people come to you trying to imagine the future all the time. When you look at it from an organizational point of view, do you see people trying to solve problems, or do you see people falling in love with specific tech and trying to put it into a box? And what do you think the optimum way is that organizations should be looking at this?
I've seen a lot of falling in love with technology and deciding that you really need that. And I think there's been a lot of random experimentation. I think you used the term the other day, random experimentation happening. And I think it's really interesting because experimentation is really important. And I 100% agree with you. We need to make that part of the culture of your organization. But at the same time, we need to make sure we have experimentation around use cases, because there are a lot of shiny things out there. Like, I'm guilty of collecting apps on my phone. Like, who has apps on their phone they never use? Everybody does that. And we do it in our jobs as well. Like, it's nice to collect this fun technology because you had a great conversation with that person, or, there's a lot of stuff out there that we don't really need. And sometimes I try and encourage people to ask the question, do we need a technology solution for that problem? Because sometimes, I don't know, if you're sad, you just need a hug. Like, you don't need another app. So I think, in summary, yes, there's a lot of falling in love with things before you necessarily know that you need to use them. And when we experiment a lot, we suffer from the sunk cost effect, right? Like, it's the same with big data. If you have all the big data, you've got to find something to do with it, got to find some insights. So I think we just need to get really strategic and really clear about what our vision is and what we're trying to achieve with technology and innovation and experimentation as well.
And Mel, with someone who plays a role in the middle of the world as you do, like, how do you see a strategy when it comes to technology and innovation playing a role, and how important is it for you to help the business understand?
Yeah, I think my personality and my history and my career, I came probably from the business performance side of things more than the technology side of things initially. So when it comes down to, you saying it, making it part of the way we do things, I think it's a huge part of the culture, having the space to innovate. We talk about the new generations of the workforce coming in. They want to be creative. They want to be trying new things and doing things differently. And yes, they want to learn about how it's done, but they also have the space and the capacity to think about how it might be different, or how we could use technology to do it differently. So it's a huge part of the culture. ROI is important. Delivering the portfolio outcomes for our investors is important, but also taking a chance, thinking about how we could do different things or better things actually helps with the change management for the other changes, the necessary changes that need to happen. So I think there's almost a symbiotic relationship between, being a little bit, taking a risk, taking a chance, and trying something new, and change adoption. I actually think there's actually a close relationship between that from a culture and success and effort needed to be invested perspective. That if you can get the culture to the point where change isn't something that feels like it needs to be resisted, that it's just that's how we do things around here, actually, is a positive for the necessary changes that need to happen, not just the opportunistic or innovative things that you want to try.
And Bernie, I'm sure that you've seen a number of organisations that have moved from pretty elaborate spreadsheets to all-encompassing technology solutions in the back end of their organisations. What do you think is probably one of the key things to really making this change stick? What is the key thing that you've seen that's really made organisations grasp that change and be successful at it?
I think after, many years of helping organisations adopt technology, I think the simplest thing I could say is communication. A big part of that fear of change is fear of the unknown. That resistance to change is resistance to the unknown. And helping people understand what the future looks like so that it's not an unknown. So education, communication is really, at the end of the day, the key. I don't think anyone who's responsible for a major change program can over-communicate.
Good advice, I feel. Let's move away from this towards ESG, and ESG has been a conversation for the last 10 years when the Property Council helped set up the Green Building Council in Australia. It seemed to have had just a run, and the importance of it hasn't seemed to have dropped off in any way, especially in the investor sort of stakes. And Julian, let's go to you on this, because Taronga took a turn from a real tech focus to a sustainability focus at some stage. Like, what did you guys see in terms of the ESG and technology space that made you sort of take a turn towards that?
Yeah, so as a fund, I mean, we're not an impact investor. That's not what our mandate is. Our mandate is to provide solutions to the likes of Dexus or a Vicinity that solve problems in their business that they want solved. And so it's no surprise that ESG is front and center of that problem list and has been for many years. And so it's just naturally occurred that we've had 80% of our portfolio delivers either an environment, a social, or a governance outcome. We're now setting out to prove that. So we've got a new ESG director who's joined us from Cushman, who's adding some rigor to how that's measured and managed. But we saw that that was actually what was helping to drive innovation forward. So it used to be about cost out or efficiency or revenue. Now people want to keep moving the needle on ESG. And so, we framed our most recent innovation program, ESG Impact. And I think there's really two classes of solutions that we're providing. So one, how do we get technologies that help to make ESG data measurement and reporting easier, right? So for a lot of sustainability teams, that's 120% of their time, right? And, really what we want to be doing is freeing them up from that data management and reporting function to actually start to look at technologies that ultimately drive actual change and move the needle on some of those ESG outcomes. And so, I think a simple way to think about this is in the problem of something like waste, right? So everybody struggles to get waste data and improve their waste streaming and reduce contamination. So, what data platforms are available to improve the accuracy of measuring waste? And now, how do we actually improve that waste streaming so there's less contamination? We know we're being charged the right amounts by our waste contractors, and we actually have a handle on what the building is producing. So, it's become so fundamental to innovation strategies for many of our owners that we've decided to just tighten up our focus and look at ESG delivering solutions.
And Mel, when you're just feeding off that sort of comment, ESG and technology to be able to measure and help manage the ESG solutions, how are you seeing that internally from an owner's point of view?
Yeah, I think the split of focus that Julian talked about is right because the E was focused on for such a long time, and we've actually got waste aside some of the other energy elements, water, gas, electricity. There's data for days on that. There's no shortage of data, and I think most of particularly the large institutional investors, have got that to a good space because our investors have demanded that, and the penalties for not having that sorted out are significant. I think where the focus is starting to go to is, ESG strategy is more than just the E, and how the other elements of it can be enabled by technology. So a big part of QIC's role is originally the heritage of retail, but that evolution into a mixed-use town centre. In terms of the community that we're facilitating and enabling, how can we use technology to provide better outcomes for that population, and our role that we play in almost being the new high street of today's society? What role and responsibility do we have in that space, and can technology meet that expectation and not just be another app on our phone that's collecting proverbial dust? I think is a challenge that we're actively exploring. How can we use tech for the non-E parts of ESG?
Yeah, and Alice, I'll jump to you on that as well, because I think, when we think about technology and how it integrates with buildings, potentially there's an evolution that this is going to expand to places, because, organizations such as Land Lease are not just about a building now, it's about creating places and precincts. Have you thought about that in particular, and how technology can help facilitate great outcomes for people and places?
Yes, we think a lot about that. We actually have there are a number of ways I could answer these questions. Excuse me for just thinking a moment. But we are aiming to create 250 million of social value in the next couple of years, and there are lots of different ways that we do that in our big place, not just individual places. And one of the ways that we track that and help to connect people through community with that is through our Work Life platform, which is it's basically an app for everybody. An app. Here I am talking about apps now. For every person who is part of the Land Lease portfolio as an end user can connect through this technology. But it's not about the technology. The actual value of that is the community creation and connecting people with causes that matter and all of those kind of things. So we are thinking about how we do the S side of things through that. And that was, I think that was shortlisted last year for an innovation award, not for the technology itself, but for the placemaking outcomes and the community that it creates and the way that it achieves all of those social kind of outcomes.
Yeah, and I think I reflect back to our Outlook lunch this year. David Harrison, I'm pretty sure, said that the S is going to be something that organisations really have to start to tackle. And it'll be interesting to see how technology plays a part in helping manage that. Julian?
Yeah. So I might pick up on that. I think we were talking before about how hard it is to measure S, right? And people would have said the same thing 15, 20 years ago about carbon, right? So the question is, how do we innovate in this space and start to move towards more and more confidence around the value of what we're delivering? So, for example, in last year's ESG Impact Program, we supported a company out of the UK called Social Value Portal. And in the UK, the government has actually required, if you're going to sell services or products to the government, you've got to prove the social value that you create, because they want to know every dollar of taxpayer money is going back to help local communities. And so that's been a movement that's come out of the UK, and this group similarly looks to do it here in Australia. So looking at your cleaning teams, so how many people from disadvantaged backgrounds are you bringing on? What kind of employment training programs do you have for youth, right? And then start to take not just an index of that improvement, but put a dollar